consolidating his power, his position as king. There were two high priests, one Abiathar, of course, his friend, David's friend at Hebron, but then also Zadok at Gibeon. So the country is still politically and religiously divided. And David is determined to unify. And one of the ways of doing this is let's bring the ark to Jerusalem and let's get everybody on the same page, if you will. David, of course, first tries to move the ark in a cart. Verse 4 of this chapter, we read it last week. They brought it with the ark of God from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Ahio was walking ahead of the ark. Well, I'm sorry, back to verse 3. They placed the ark of God on a new cart, that they might bring it to the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Uzziah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were leading the new cart. Why a cart? Well, they had seen the Philistines. The Philistines had sent the ark to Kiriath Jearim. They had sent the ark on a cart. If you remember that story, the Philistines had captured the ark. They had had a number of tragedies, a number of disasters befall their idols. They realized we got to get this ark out of here because this ark is tearing up our God, Dagon, and causing all kinds of other problems. We got to get this ark out of here. And so they send it on its way to Kiriath Jearim with two milk cows pulling the cart. So they've seen the ark transported by a cart, and nobody apparently either remembers or bothers to check on what's the right way to move the ark. And we find out, of course, what happens. Well, I think we know what happens. But the transport of the ark using a cart, this was in direct violation of God's law. The ark, if we read over in Exodus 25, it'll tell us exactly how they were supposed to move the ark. Exodus 25, verses 14 and 15 says, back up to verse 13. You shall make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold, and you shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark and carry the ark with them. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark. They shall not be removed from it. When the poles are supposed to be there, the poles are used to carry the ark. They're not to be removed while the ark is in transport. The ark was to be covered with a skin, with a porpoise skin, as a protection. The ark was to be carried by Levites. If we turn over to the book of Numbers, and we'll see over in the book of Numbers, Numbers 30 and 31 and 30 and 31. Back to verse 29. The families of the sons of Kohath were to camp on the southward side of the tabernacle, and the leaders of the fathers' households of the Kohathite families were Elizaphan, the son of Uzziel. Now the duties involved the ark, the table, the lampstands, the altars, the utensils of the sanctuary with which they minister, and the screens and all the service concerning them. And then we turn over to chapter 4 and verse 14 and 15. They shall also put all the utensils that they serve in connection with it, the fire pans, the forks, and the shovels, and the basins, all the utensils of the altar, and they shall spread a cover of porpoise skin over it and insert its poles. And when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the holy objects and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, then the camp is to set out. After that, the sons of Kohath shall carry them, so that they may not touch the holy objects and die. These are the things of the tent of the meeting which the sons of Kohath are to carry. So there was a very prescribed way that the ark was to be transported. It was to be carried. It was to be carried by a particular family. It was to be carried in a particular way, and no one was supposed to touch it. Well, of course, we know what happens. Knowing this story, as we probably do, in chapter 6 and verse 6, as they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out toward the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen nearly upset it. And the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died there by the ark of God. And David became angry because of the Lord's outburst against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. So David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" And David was unwilling to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David with him, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Thus the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. So Uzzah reaches out to steady the ark. He touches it, and he's struck dead. God had said over in Numbers, we read, don't touch it. It's not to be touched. And you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. Didn't the Philistines touch it when they were loading it onto the ark? Well, probably they did. Why weren't they struck dead? Well, perhaps because this covenant did not apply to them. Perhaps God gave them grace so that they were not struck dead for touching his ark, even though they weren't supposed to. But certainly the children of Israel should have known. That's the point here. They had the law. They had the Holy Scriptures. They should have known, and didn't bother to check. Some of the Bible critics then, when they read this, they think, well, that's awfully severe. Now, come on. You're going to strike a man dead just because he tries to do essentially something good. He sees the ark of God being upset, maybe about to fall out of the cart onto the ground, and he reaches out to steady it, and he's immediately struck dead. Doesn't that seem to be a little severe for God to behave in such a way? Doesn't that seem to be unfair? Of course, we're all about fairness these days. Isn't that unfair for God to behave in such a way? Well, the point is that God gave him the command. God gave him the command back in Numbers. He gave him the command. Here's how you do it. He gave him explicit instructions. Here's how you do it. And we should take as this an understanding that there is no command of God that's to be treated trivially. We don't treat the commands of God as casual suggestions. This was not a suggestion. This was not a if you feel like it or if you think it's a good idea kind of a thing. This was a do it this way kind of a thing. And when they didn't do it that way, well, when somebody made the mistake of ignoring the law, they paid the price. And unfortunately, it's Uzzah. And you can say, well, again, does that sound fair? Hey, Uzzah was of the priesthood. Who else would have known the law better or should have known the law better than Uzzah? And yet, even he reached out and did something stupid. David's angry. David's angry about this, and he's angry. Some of the scholars suggest maybe even angry at God. Others suggest that he's angry at the Levites for not knowing or for not telling him, not warning him. But David clearly expects that God was going to bless him. David has been told he's going to be blessed. He recognized he's this anointed one, and God's going to bless him. And I'm transporting the ark, and I'm doing something good. And now God struck this guy dead. Why is this happening to me? It's kind of an attitude on David's part. And it's a lesson. It's a lesson to David that unfortunately his present predecessor never learned, which was to say, I want obedience. I don't want good intentions. Yes, I understand that Uzzah was reaching out to steady the ark, and he had only the best of intentions. Best of intentions are not good enough. The requirement here is obedience. You're going to obey me. And David, is kind of thrown in despair about this. Did David know? Here's an interesting question. Did David know that he was transporting the ark in an incorrect manner? Did he know he was doing it wrong? And some of the scholars, depends on who you read. The scholars argue about this. You want to read some fun arguments, go raise this question. Did David know? Some of the scholars say, oh, yes, of course he knew. He knew. He just decided to do it the easy way, the way the Philistines had done, on a cart. And others say, no, that in this 3-month time that the ark sat there in the house of Obed-Edom, well, that in that time, David had time to research a little bit and find out we did it wrong. And so we don't know. My own particular thought is that David was just flat out ignorant about how the religious training, the religious instruction had so deteriorated, I think, in Israel, that a lot of folks just didn't know. They just didn't know how this was to be transported. And so when they try to do this and it fails, now they start reading the scriptures. You never quite look at your Bible until after the disaster strikes, but here it is. And so David starts to do his study and finds out that he learns that it should be transported this way. If we look over in 1 Chronicles 15, and read 1 through 13, and I'm not going to read all of this. I'm going to back up in verse 11 and start there. It says, Then David called for Zadok and Abiathar the priests, and for the Levites, for Uriel, Asasiah, Joel, Shemaiah, Eliel, and Aminadab, and said to them, You are the heads of the fathers' households and of the Levites. Consecrate yourselves, both you and your relatives, that you may bring the ark of the Lord God of Israel to the place that I prepared for it. Because you did not carry it at first, the Lord our God has made an outburst on us, for we did not seek him according to the ordinance. So David, at some point, realizes we didn't do it right, and he tells the priests that. He says, So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord God of Israel. And the sons of the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders with the poles thereon, as Moses had commanded them according to the word of God. So now they do it right. Now, did David know beforehand? I don't think he did. Personally, I don't think he did. Now, the Bible doesn't say specifically, but I don't think he did. I think he was ignorant and just, can we use a cart, David? Sure, get a cart. That's what the Philistines did. Yes, sir. Yes. Willfully, yeah. Yes. Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. I can't see him just willfully blowing off a command of God if he knew about it. I tend to agree. That's why I tend to think he did not know ahead of time. He did not know, or did not. Yeah, he was just ignorant. He was just flat ignorant of the right way to transport the ark, and did some research. Had the priest maybe look into it, or some scribes maybe look into it, find out the answer, and now we're going to do it right. Yes. Yes. Right. That's an interesting thought. I had not considered that. That, yeah, Uzzah, did Uzziah know? Did these priests know? Certainly, if anyone would have been in a position to know, it would have been these men. Yeah, Rita. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a good point. All of these Jews should have known. They knew the law. They knew of the law. They knew of the law. They certainly understood that they were supposed to be worshiping God, and and yet nobody remembered the right way to transport the ark. I mean, it does seem a little far fetched, doesn't it? That nobody knew, and it may be just as we just discussed, that here is in verse 7, God struck him down there for his irreverence, his lack of respect. And it may well be that he knew they were transporting it wrong. And it was kind of like, well, okay, if the king says it's okay, I guess it must be okay, or something along that line. We don't know. We don't know exactly, but that's a good point. They certainly should have known. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot to that too. It was a new cart. This was not just some old, you know, pickup truck or grain wagon. They were, they pressed into service. This was probably, you're right, a custom built cart, specifically for this purpose, specifically for the purpose of moving the ark, which unfortunately they were doing it not according to the will of God. We're gonna find a number of times here where we're going to understand that we're going to see some really strong examples, I think, where the silence of God does not give permission. Did God ever say, don't move it in a cart? No. What did he say? He said, get the poles in there and pick it up and carry it. He didn't say, oh, but don't use the cart. He never had to spell that out to them. And we're going to see some other examples of that. Yeah, Regina? That's a good point. Yes, that's exactly right. If we think we're doing it right, we ought to be able to, as some of the earlier preachers would say, we ought to have a "Thus saith the Lord" in the things we do, and not just assume that, okay, we're going to do it this way, and we're going to assume that God wants it this way, that this is okay with God. That's an excellent point. Any other comments? Yes. Right. Yeah, I've never noticed that before, but that's an excellent point. Yeah, it doesn't matter if it's good to you, being the assembly. Um, yeah, yeah, because they're basically, we might assume they were either basically ignorant or, like I said, they had seen the Philistines move the ark with a cart, and they must have from that perhaps just assumed, well, that must be okay too. If the Philistines can do it, why can't we? That kind of an attitude. Yes. Yeah. It is presumptuous. Yes, it is a presumptuous that well, God let the Philistines do it, He'll let me do it. Yeah, Irene. Yes, yes, I think that's good. Yes. Okay, so they leave the ark there at the house of Obed Edom the Gittite for a period of time. Now they're going to finally move it the right way into Jerusalem. Verse 12. Now it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God. And David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And so it was, when the bearers of the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. And David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of the trumpet. Then it happened, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, that Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. So they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Further, he distributed to all the people and to all the multitude of Israel, both to men and women, a cake of bread and one of the dates and one of the raisins to each one. Then it was that the people departed, each to his house. And so now they move the ark again. This time they do it right. They bring it up on the poles, and David offers David offers this sacrifice. David, it says, is wearing a linen ephod, which was usually worn by the priests. And some of the scholars then asked the question, was David assuming the role of the priest because he's wearing a linen ephod, number one. And number two, it says here that he is offering these sacrifices. In verse 13, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. And in verse 17, David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the question comes up, was David actually officiating? Now, it depends on which scholar you read. Some will say, yes, that David was acting in the role of priest, some would even go so far as to say as a type of Christ, who is both priest and king. That here's David acting as both priest and king. Others will go, don't think so. David's still under the Old Testament law. The Old Testament law requires that the offerings are done by the priests out of the tribe of Levi. David, of course, is not a Levite. He is of the tribe of Judah. And though it says that David was offering the sacrifices, David was having the sacrifices available, but the priests were the ones actually doing the work as prescribed by the law. And I tend to believe that that's the case. I don't think that David here was literally, performing the sacrifices. I think, or Samuel and Saul. Yeah. Now, why would you condemn Samuel or Saul for doing that and not condemn David if he was doing the same thing? And so that's why I think that when it says here that David was offering the sacrifices, that it was David at David's command, it was being done, but the priests were the ones that were actually doing it. I would also point out, it says he's wearing this ephod. The ephod here was a garment of a priest. That's true, but it was also a garment of humility. It was intended to be a garment of humility. It was a fairly plain type of clothing, and so in some of the scholars looking at this would suggest that David is doing this not because he's assuming the role of the priest, but rather David is desiring to humble himself before God, and so he's dressing in this very plain clothing, and presenting himself to God in this in what is effectively a humble way. It says he's dancing before the Lord with all his might. This dancing this idea of dancing is the idea of, some have said, whirling, and it is this type of ecstasy. Some of you perhaps you've heard the phrase the whirling dervish, which was a dance of religious ecstasy among some of the Middle Eastern folks. They would get into these sort of a religious frenzy, and they would do this kind of a twirling dance thing, this spinning move. And here's David dancing with all his might before God. It was a celebration. It was a time of great celebration. They're bringing the ark into the city of David. It would have been a time of great joy. It would have been a time of tremendous exultation. And David is happy to have it happen, and is expressing it that way. Now we notice though that as we see here that his wife Michal is looking out the window and sees him, and she despises it. Why does she despise it? Yeah, he's acting like a commoner. He's not acting kingly, as it says here in verse 16. Notice here in verse 16 that it says that it happened as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David that Michal, the daughter of Saul. Notice that the author has to include that phrase, the daughter of Saul. And some of the scholars, again, looking at this, are saying, there's a reason he put that phrase in there, the daughter of Saul, because the idea is the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. And she's got the same viewpoint of the king and the same viewpoint of religion that her father had, which namely is, the king is on a much higher plane. The king has ultimate authority, not God. The king has ultimate authority, and so I'm gonna be paying attention to what the king does, and the king is expected to behave himself in a certain a decorum, a certain aloofness, a certain haughtiness, if you will. Even before God, he's to behave himself in that way. And David doesn't behave in that way, and she can't stand it. Basically, this is not what my dad would do. My dad never did that, if you can think of it that way. And so she's fairly disgusted with him. Yeah, she's been, of course, we talked about this I think either last week or the week before, that, if you recall the storyline, of course, Michal here she was married to David, but when David had to flee from Saul, she was left alone. So her father, Saul, decides to hook her up with another guy, hooks her up with another man, and she lives with him as husband and wife for probably a period of at least about 10 years. And now David says, I want my wife back. And so he gets his wife back. But at this point, the relationship between them is broken. It was just broken. And there are certain things that men will break that it is beyond the power of man to fix. And this was one of them. Yeah. Michal. I don't know if it's Michael, Michal. I'm guessing Michal because I don't want to call her Michael. That sounds weird to me, but that's just no. Yeah. Well, we're going to get to that. In fact, we're going to get to that here in just a second about that, because she goes on in the next chapter to taunt him. She confronts him about it. Verse 20 says, when David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel distinguished himself today. He uncovered himself today in the eyes of his servants, maids, as one of the foolish ones shamelessly uncovers himself. So David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me the ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I celebrate before the Lord. And I will be more lightly esteemed than this, and will be humble in my own eyes. But with the maids with whom you have spoken, with them I will be distinguished. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Yeah, again, she was identified as the daughter of Saul, confirming that, sort of her point of view of religion is perhaps very similar to what her father is. Both of them were tending to view the king as the ultimate authority of how things should be run, not God. And so she taunts David. the text here is suggesting that he actually exposed himself. I don't believe that's the case. I believe that this is almost certainly untrue, that he was exposing himself in some way, in some immoral way, but rather it was likely that he dressed down, as we talk about. He dressed like a commoner. He put on his humble clothes and he began to dance. And to Michal's point of view, this was just not done. This was just not right to do things this way. The king doesn't put aside his kingly robes and humble himself before anybody. And David's saying, I humbled myself before God. And, and by the way, if you recall, he'll point out, by the way, God put me in charge of this country ahead of your dad, your father, and your whole family, by the way. And just so you kind of catch on to that, yes, I'm now in charge, and not you, and not your dad, not your family. But it's clear that, or it seems clear, that she doesn't grasp his humility before God. She just can't get a hold of it. Then it talks about this last verse. This last verse is, again, another one of those kind of a controversy in a teacup, if you will, among Bible scholars. Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. And some people are asking, well, was this because of God's judgment that, God didn't allow her womb to be open, and so therefore she got to have no child? Or is it because that David just basically said, I don't think I need you I don't think I need you to be bugging me like this. And John, you had a quote one time, I think as I recall, about some scholar who had written about this, saying that David left her wonderfully alone. I can't remember exactly who you said made that quote, but No, I don't think you get to, because I remember you clearly quoted somebody else in doing it. I just don't remember who it was. But yeah, you had quoted somebody else that says David left her wonderfully alone, that he may have had no intimate relationship with her, even though she is his wife. He may have, said, "Hey, I got plenty of wives. I'll just, put you aside, and you can just, wait." And in which case, if that's the case, that's maybe another failing of David in that account, in that he would have, as her husband, had a responsibility to work things out with her, to try to fix things. But again, this relationship, with what's happened, as we have recounted of what's happened with this relationship, it's pretty well broken. It's a pretty broken relationship. There is a reference that she had children. Josephus reports that she had children with another husband, but he may have been confusing Michal with her sister Merab. This is in 2 Samuel 21. Looking ahead a few chapters. 2 Samuel 21 and verse 8. And it says, so the king took the two sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Ahiah, Armoni, and Mephibosheth, whom she had borne to Saul, and the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she had borne to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mahathalite. And the 5 sons of Merab, again, there are some texts that will in fact substitute the name of Michal here for Merab, and perhaps Josephus got confused on which sister it was that had the children, but we don't know. There is from this no then resulting lineage of Saul to go forward, other than Mephibosheth. All right. So from that, then we're getting into chapter 7. We'll continue on with chapter 7. And it says, now it came about that when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest on every side from all his enemies, that the king said to Nathan the prophet, see now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within tent curtains. And Nathan said to the king, go and do all that is in your mind, for the Lord is with you. But it came about in the same night that the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, go and say to my servant David, thus saith the Lord, are you the one who should build me a house to dwell in? For I have not dwelt in a house since the day I brought up the sons of Israel from Egypt, even to this day. But I have been moving around about in a tent, even in a tabernacle. Wherever I have gone with all the sons of Israel, wherever I have gone with all the sons of Israel, did I speak a word to one of the tribes of Israel, saying, which I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now, therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, following sheep, that you should be ruler over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make you a great name, like the names of the great men who are on the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them that they may live in their own place and not be disturbed again, nor will the wicked afflict them any more as formerly. Even from the day that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord also declares that to you that the Lord will make a house for you. Here's David. David takes it upon himself. He says, maybe he's feeling guilty. He says, I live in this nice cedar house. We talked about that nice cedar house. This would have been a luxurious house by the standards of the day. It would have been a very deluxe house by the standards of the day. And yet he sees the Ark of the Covenant. It resides in a tent. It's in a tabernacle. And so David proposes to build a temple. Nathan is first, here's the first mention of Nathan the prophet, who apparently is a friend of David, advises him to proceed, but he is speaking. If you read the text, you'll understand that Nathan's first response is really as a friend and not as a prophet. Why, go ahead, David. Yeah, it sounds like a great idea. Go ahead and do that. Yeah. Okay. It's fine. I don't mind backing up. Michael? Oh, really? Yes. Yes.
The other man, he divorced her, left her. She could not technically be married to the first husband.
Yes. Yes. Because I remember seeing that before.
So that may have been the problem, one of the problems. David wanted property back, long any functional relationship.
As husband and wife, yes.
She would have just been in the era, not
Yeah.
honored.
Yeah. Given the circumstances were, of course, that if that woman was divorced from her husband, married to another, the first husband couldn't take her back. Now, and I think we pointed out even at the time that event happened, it was recorded as having happened in Samuel, First Samuel. Her father takes her and gives her to another man. Basically, puts her into the role of an adulteress. We mentioned that last time, because she wasn't divorced from David. David had never given her a certificate of divorce.
By the way, she was probably very happy.
Yeah, apparently so. Yeah, he followed her for like 10 miles, crying as he went. And so, yeah, clearly she had this relationship with his other husband, and there's certain things that men will break, and like I said, they break it so bad they can't fix it. There is no fixing it, at least not by the hand of man. Yeah, Regina? Yes. Yes. Well, some scholars think there would have been a way there to unify the house of David and the house of Saul. If David has a child with Michelle, whatever, and they that, as you point out, that child is the grandson of Saul, and and could have been a unifier of the two factions, if you will, within the sort of the political landscape. Um, but yeah, it never happened, and we don't know if it didn't happen because again, God prevented it, or we don't know if it didn't happen because David never intimate with her after getting her back. Um, but yeah, clearly it was. She she had she had been in love with David at one time, as John pointed out. She'd been very much in love with David. She'd help him escape from her own father, if you remember that, back in that book of Samuel, 1 Samuel. She'd helped him escape from her father, and yet been given to another man. And it's clear that in the ensuing years, she's no longer in love with him and becoming very bitter. That's a good point. I tell you what, I'm going to stop there. It's 20 after. I'm going to stop there. We'll be looking at next week about what God says about the temple, and consider, and we might be asking the question, did God ever want a temple? And be thinking about that as we get ready to study further into chapter 7. Thank you very much for your attention and comments this morning.